Hello and welcome to the fourth edition of The Bookshelf, a podcast where we bring you the latest scholarship on all aspects of South Asia, social, political, economic, and the international relations of the region. This interactive platform allows us to hear from some of the most distinguished authors of subjects concerning the region. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Tanvi Madan, to discuss her new book titled The Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped the US-India Relations During the Cold War. Dr. Tanvi Madan is a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program and the director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Dr. Madan did her PhD from Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and the book is the culmination of her doctoral research. The Fateful Triangle is not only a rigorous piece of historical research informed by generous yet meticulous sourcing of new archival material, but it is also a refreshingly new rendition on India-US relations during the Cold War. This historical account is a must-read for all those who are interested in understanding the role which China played in India-US relations during the Cold War. And if the often made statement that history repeats itself holds any truth, the book is also a great reference to understand the contemporary geostrategic churning in the Indo-US relations in the backdrop of a rising and assertive China. Tanvi, welcome to the bookshelf.
Thank you for having me on the show, Yogesh.
It's a pleasure. So first of all, we often ask our authors where does the study they put on started. The Indo-US relationship during the Cold War has been viewed either through the prism of bipolar rivalry between the US and Soviet Union or the Western policy of maintaining a balance between India and Pakistan. Can you please elaborate on why and how China angle became central to your understanding of the bilateral relationship?
So very inadvertently, I did not go into this study looking for a China angle. This was not supposed to be a project about China. This started off as a project wanting to take another look at the history of US-India relations. We had by that time, by kind of the early 2000s, a few studies on US-India relations, but they had tended to have been written without kind of access to archival materials that had been becoming available both in India, but also in the US at more presidential libraries, as well as kind of some of the old Warsaw Bloc countries had started to put out their information. The Chinese had started to release some archives. So the idea was to go and take another look at US-India relations and see what had been driving that relationship. To me, the existing explanations did not seem satisfactory. It couldn't quite explain the ups and downs in the relationship that many people talked about. And so while I was sitting in the LBJ library, looking at the papers on US policy towards India, I was expecting to see certain things that we knew of in the mid-60s, things like how India fit in, or how the LBJ administration saw India vis-a-vis Vietnam, perhaps, during the course of the 1965 war, vis-a-vis Pakistan, something on economics, something on the Soviet Union. What I didn't expect to see and yet kept seeing was references to China. What would happen if India, for example, faltered in terms of economic reform or agricultural reform and productivity? The concern was, this would be a win for China, because it would mean India had kind of fallen back in the race, the fateful race that was ongoing between communist China and democratic India. And so you saw not just officials in the Johnson administration, but also the president himself, quite concerned from both a strategic perspective and a political perspective, that they could not lose India in the way, for example, that President Truman had allegedly lost China to the communist world, or in terms of India kind of not doing well enough as a democracy. And so that got me thinking about, well, is this a one-off? And I'd seen it in other senses in the Johnson administration, Johnson himself keeping track of rainfall figures, for example, to make sure that India was producing enough agriculturally. But I wanted to know, is this a one-off, or did we see this across administrations? And also, I was particularly interested in seeing whether on the Indian side too, there was a sense of connecting the relationships that India had with China and with the US. Were these relationships interacting? And so that kind of informed how I got stumbled into the China angle, because when I did go back and look at it, I noticed from the Truman administration on, that is when India became independent, how the US saw China shaped how it saw India. It wasn't the only factor, it wasn't the only driver, but it did make a difference to India policy, and the same thing on the Indian side.
Sure. Uh, as historians often say, archives show us the way. Uh, the four major sections of the book correspond to the role China played in Indo-US relationship. Can you briefly reflect on the factors which created these eras, as you say in the book, of divergence, convergence, disillusionment, and disengagement in the Indo-US relationship?
Sure. So one of the things I wanted to think about is, today we think, for example, it's almost kind of a well-known parable that shared concerns about a rising China's behavior are shaping U.S.-India relations, driving them together into a partnership. But what I found when I was looking at the history of kind of how China as a factor shaped US-India relations, it was more complex. It had different kinds of impacts on the relationship. And that is how this book is structured. So what I look at is that between kind of 1949, you could even take it back to 1947, but essentially from the time the People's Republic is formed, of China is formed in 1949, through about 1955, particularly early 1956, you saw the US and India have disagreements about China. And this was the subject of divergence between the two countries, and it actually created problems for the US-India relationship. It caused divergence between them. So this is a phase that I call divergence. After that, there's a period of convergence between 1956 and about 1962, 1963, where I call it as a phase of convergence. There is agreement not just on the subject between the US and India. It's not just that their perceptions on China match. They agree on the nature of the Chinese challenge, the extent of it, and the immediacy of it, but they also have a fair amount of overlap in terms of what they think the right approach is in terms of dealing with that China challenge. And in both cases, they saw each other as part of the solution to their China problem. After that, you see a phase between 1963 and about kind of 1968 or 69, what I call the period of dependence and disillusion. That is, this is a time when US-India relations actually stay fairly tethered because of China. Both continue to have the shared concern about China. And so they both still need each other. The US needs India because it cannot have India fail. So it needs to support India, because this idea that there's been a fateful race between China and India, the US needed to at least, if not help India win, at least not make sure it didn't lose or falter. It was too big to fail in language we might use today. And so you see this period where they're actually pretty dependent on the idea of the other, in some cases, the actuality of the other in terms of support, but you start to see disillusionment set in. Why does disillusionment set in? A couple of different reasons. For one, while the two countries still agree on the nature and urgency of the China challenge, they start to disagree, start to be differences on how to deal with the challenge. India, for example, wants the Soviet Union to be part of the solution to its China challenge. The US sees the Soviet Union as part of the problem. Same to do with differences on where Pakistan fit in, as a solution or as part of the problem vis-a-vis China. So they start to disagree in approach. I think the second thing that starts to set, for the reason the disillusionment sets in, both sides start to question the other's willingness and capability and commitment to dealing with this problem. So you see that period. There's a brief period of kind of real disruption between, I think, especially around 1971 that I outlined during the course of the 1971 India-Pakistan war, where India goes from seeing the US, which had essentially given it an implicit assurance against another attack by China, to seeing the US arrayed with China and Pakistan opposite it. And so it rushes to go and complete an agreement, a treaty with the Soviet Union. The final phase in the book is kind of this period of essentially disengagement till there's a little bit of an effort at reset. And this is a phase where between 1973 and 1979, you see the two countries get things back on track, but that track is at a very different level than what had been before. Both sides need each other a lot less. And with China and the US having undertaken this rapprochement, the need for the India and the US just diminishes considerably. And there's no other source of major strategic convergence. So for a while, you see the two countries sort of reset their relationships, but it's at a much lower level. And to some extent, even institutionally, they do disengage. And we don't see that re-engagement at that level that we'd seen in the 50s and 60s till at least 2 or 3 decades after the 70s.
So I couldn't help but notice that half of the book basically talks about a period where Nehru is at the helm of affairs as far as Indian foreign policy is concerned. And there have always been views, and which have gained some traction recently, concerning the failure or so of Prime Minister Nehru's China policy and his inability to play the balance of power politics. What is your reflection of Nehru, both as a statesman, but also his foreign policy?
So I think, it is hard. One of the things, as a historian, you will understand this. One of the things, you become quite aware of when you're sitting in the archives is the number of constraints that face policymakers and trade-offs. And so, counterfactuals are always hard. And like everybody, I can look back and think about things that Nehru could have done differently. And where I think, yes, he clearly did fall short on his China policy, he and other officials around him, because otherwise you would not have seen not just a war break out between China and India, but also one that India kind of was defeated quite soundly in. I think where I come down on it is, at least in terms of his China policies, I think the mistakes, so to speak, that I think he made weren't the ones necessarily that people traditionally talk about. Well, he was naive on China. I actually think he understood, even if he didn't understand the extent or the immediacy, I think he did understand from the very beginning that China posed a challenge. I think he thought he had time to deal with it. And so you'd hear him, for example, even when China first, the People's Republic of China is formed, he talks about it, or in the, in the early 50s, he'll say, it will be a challenge. We have about, and he even predicts, I think at one point there's a statement, in a decade, it'll be more of a problem. But what he didn't understand it ended up being a problem even before. So I think it was a question of not understanding the immediacy, the urgency of the challenge, not understanding or not wanting to take, for example, the decisions or making the trade-offs that would have been required if this is something George Fernandez pointed out when he was defense minister, that one of the reasons, and his point was that not just Nehru, a lot of Indian prime ministers since made the same judgment call that yes, China is a challenge, but if you really kind of have to take account of how much of a challenge it is, it would require policymakers to make trade-offs they don't want to make. And so Nehru had the same issue where he told himself he had time, but he also had other priorities. Development was more of a priority. He did not want to spend the money that would have been China, really assessing the China challenge would have required on defense. He thought Pakistan was a bigger issue. He was much more focused on dealing with that than he was China. And so these are just two of the trade-offs I think he made. I think the other mistake perhaps, and again, these are all things I can say in hindsight, is he did a little bit of mirror imaging with Beijing. I think he thought that this idea that China and India are similar to Asian countries coming out after years of kind of their decision being not strategically autonomous, so to speak, that the countries would be, that Beijing, like him, would be focused on economic development at home and trying to keep a peace and tranquility in the neighborhood. And I think he misunderstood or misunderestimated, to use George Bush's famous term, that China might actually take actions that would disrupt the peace and stability for its own interest. And so I think he did not make the right judgment call. As for foreign policy, well, everybody complains about, and one of the things I do in the book is reconceptualize what non-alignment is. So for all the complaints about non-alignment, and we can sit and assess whether that's a right or wrong move, but the fact that it has had so much staying power, that today it continues to exist. You can call it different things. I call it diversification in the book. But the idea that India should be strategically autonomous and have multiple options has persisted through every Indian government, even though, yes, they do align sometimes with some countries or blocs more than others.
Sure. Speaking about diversification, as a historian, I couldn't help but notice that starting in late 1950s with the death of Stalin, Soviet Union becomes a critical factor, not only in India's calculation, but also American calculation of what India's options are. So even in the fateful triangle of US, India, China, the Soviet Union played a significant role. How did Indian and American decision makers view the entry of Soviet Union in this trilateral contest?
So it's interesting. It plays a role in kind of different ways. I think in the mid-50s, so from about 1955, 56, when the Soviet leaders, post-Stalin Soviet leaders, go on this Soviet economic offensive, it really kind of gets competitive spirits going in the US in a way that perhaps China's Belt and Road Initiative does today, which is, you see, as David Engerman, the historian, in his book Price of Aid points out, this development space, today we call it the connectivity space, becomes competitive. And so it kind of sparks the competitive instincts for the US, but it's also within a broader framing, which is India becomes important. So for the second Eisenhower term, the administration in the US sees India, because now it sees the Cold War as an ideological and economic battle as well, which is they see the need to help India, as I'd said, win this race with the other Asian giant, China, that was a communist power backed by the Soviet Union. So here too, kind of the Soviets, in the shadow, in the background. But then you see a phase where, India, for example, with the Soviet Union, which had, while there were signs of a Sino-Soviet split, in the late 50s and kind of early 60s, India is aware that at the end of the day, the Soviet Union is an ally of China's, and as Khrushchev would put it, is only a friend of India's. It tries to use or tries to get the military capabilities from the Soviet Union, but on the other hand, also tries to get Moscow to use its influence with Beijing to sort out the boundary dispute, or at least not to have it escalate. That obviously did not work. That relationship falls short. India also found during the 62 war that Moscow's help was not just not forthcoming, but it was actually actively unhelpful. And now we know, I doubt the Indian government knew at the time, that the Soviets had also been providing intelligence to the Chinese on India and had stalled the supply of MiGs, which the Indian government did know. But after the Sino-Soviet split happens, again, in a balance of power way, and for all this idea that Indian leaders did not play this game, of course they played this game, they just played it differently, is that they suddenly see that the Soviet Union becomes an option for them. And so you have this strange dynamic in the 60s, where while they might have disagreed on a lot of other things, one thing the Soviet Union and the US agreed upon is that they needed to support India against China, because both had bad relations. And so at one point, American leaders actually say, well, if the Soviets want to do that to help India, good for them, let them try, because we haven't succeeded in that. I think where the Soviet relationship with India does put, again, echoes, you hear echoes of it today, that then actually did, and now there's a potential to, that where it posed a constraint on the US-India relationship is that American policymakers did not want India to overspend on defense. And so it essentially made the provision of American military equipment to India contingent on India reducing or limiting what it bought from the Soviet Union. And so, in that sense, the US actually took itself out of the game by putting that contingency. And so you see then that India essentially becomes far more dependent on the Soviet Union, which then going into kind of India continues to balance the US and Soviet relations, sees both as an answer to its China problem, but then in 1971 finds the Soviet Union and really kind of aligns then with the Soviet Union or tilts towards it when it becomes clear that as it faced the China and Pakistan challenge, the US was not going to be on its side. And so you see India scrambling to sign a treaty with the Soviet Union that Indira Gandhi had in fact not wanted to sign for 2 years and had put it aside, even though there was a lot of demands or requests from the Soviets to do so earlier. And I think so. Then you see, I think basically after that point, you see the Soviet Union as India's kind of partner, patron against China, with the US not an option. And you see that actually prevail for a number of decades after that, and the legacy of it exists to this day.
Right. So in some sense, when you look at the 1971 war and the transformation of Indo-US relationship and the role China played in that transformation, what kind of a legacy, that Nixon's policy vis-a-vis China left on Indo-US relations, not only in the decades of 1970s, but even later on, even today, the strategic discourse in India points to this reference point of 1971. What is that legacy, and how has it influenced Indo-US relations?
I think, the bottom line I'll put up front, it left a legacy of questions about US reliability in India. And it left it left in India, the part of the legacy was left in India-Soviet treaty, whose ramifications are visible to this day, and including an overdependence for India on Soviet military equipment. Let me kind of unravel that a little bit. I think India would not necessarily, in a normal year, India would not necessarily have minded a Sino-US rapprochement. After all, before Nixon ever tried a rapprochement, Indira Gandhi, in fact, in 1968, after she felt more assured of India's capability, having kind of come out the better in the skirmishes that India and China had in 1967, the Indian economy was doing better, and India had made kind of certain inroads in the diplomatic space. She reaches out to China, and at that point there was not too much of a response from Beijing that was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. You do see the Chinese respond 2 years later in 1970, the so-called famous Mao smile. At that point, it was in India that there wasn't too much of a response, and this is where you see kind of bureaucratic politics play a role, where the Soviet hands in the Indian government encouraged, advocated against a rapprochement, whereas the China hands, people like Brajesh Mishra, who went on to become, who was chargé at the time in Beijing, but went on to become National Security Advisor decades later, but encouraged this kind of rapprochement. In the end, Indira Gandhi did not follow through on that. But what you saw during 1971 is then having India's rapprochement with China not having worked out, India faced with the US, which it had more or less since 1962, 1963, particularly through the Air Defense Agreement of 1963, had at least an implicit assurance, security assurance from the US, or a commitment of sorts, that if China ever attacked India again, that the US and India would consult mutually in terms of thinking about how the US would come to India's defense. Now, this had become a question even in 1965, where there's in fact more of a danger of China intervening in an India-Pakistan war. And at that point, the US had warned China off against intervening, as well as asked India if it wanted to invoke this agreement. I think in 1971, it becomes clear to India that because of Sino-US rapprochement, what we today call perhaps a G2, which almost seemed to have been sprung overnight, though India did have some advance warning compared to even US allies like Japan, because I think it had been signaled by both Nixon and Kissinger on their visits to India earlier in the, both that year and earlier, that there would be a rapprochement. What I think you have is for India in the middle of the Bangladesh crisis, where it was clear in the summer of 1971 that there was a potential war brewing between India and Pakistan, with Indian concerns that China would enter the war or intervene in the war on behalf of Pakistan. So India is thinking, okay, we're going to be a raid against China and Pakistan. Indian policymakers try to suss out American officials, particularly then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, about what the US response would be. Would they intervene as promised to help India out or deter China against intervening? And they get a very ambiguous reply, which once it becomes clear that this ambiguous reply on the part Washington is because of its unfolding rapprochement with China. India rushes. Indira Gandhi gives instructions to rush to complete this treaty that had been there had been a draft of this India-Soviet treaty since 1969. The Soviets had put it forward. Indira Gandhi had been reluctant to sign it. But in 1971, when it becomes clear the US would no longer be an option as a partner against China, India rushes to complete this treaty, this 1971 treaty, which goes further in some ways, is more it's less unilateral in terms of support and commitment than India's air defense agreement with the US. This 1971 treaty with the Soviet Union that then paved the way for the relationship in the decades ahead. Basically said that the two would kind of consult and try to deter China and help each other if China attacked either country. So in this case, India was making a commitment to the Soviet Union as well. I think this 1971 is a crucial moment. And then of course, the Soviet Union does help supply India military equipment that is useful and cover at the UN during the 1971 war. But India also learned another lesson from the 71 war on the Soviets, which is that the Soviets had also put constraints on it about what it could do during the war and how long it could fight the war. So I think in some ways it was a lesson on why strategic autonomy and overdependence is also, also overdependence could constrain that strategic autonomy, even if India was dependent on the Soviet Union, not just the US. The other thing that of course happens during the 71 war is the US sending the USS Enterprise, the White House sending the USS Enterprise to the Bay of Bengal. Whether it was a signal, still debate about whether it was a signal to Pakistan, to India against deterring it from attacking West Pakistan, then West Pakistan, today's Pakistan, or it was a signal to, and there's more evidence of this now, that it was a signal to the Chinese to show that that US could be a reliable partner to countries like Pakistan and therefore partners to countries like China in the future. So it was supposed to be attractive as a partner. Regardless, you hear the US enterprise brought up consistently as, look, this is a moment in 1971, but also then in 1972 when the Shanghai Communique is signed between Nixon and Mao, China and the US, where you see, I think, the germs of India's concern about a G2, which again persists to this day, which is in that communique, the two sides agree to cooperate and coordinate on South Asia. And for India, suddenly in 1971-72, suddenly it finds its own interests at the, kind of hostage to what's happening with US-China relations, and that the two sides were going to kind of divvy up South Asia or, coordinate on it without taking heed of Indian sensitivities, and yet affecting potentially adversely India's interests. So I think that legacy remains to this day. I think the two countries, the US and India, have gotten over it to some extent. The defense legacy remains in terms of the Soviet Union having been India's major military supplier. But I think, in terms of getting over it, the recent kind of exercise between the Indian Navy and the US Navy in the Bay of Bengal with the US aircraft carrier, to some extent tells you that the two countries have moved on, at least to some extent. But it remains kind of, this is why history matters. It leaves you with a lot of baggage to get over at some point.
Yeah, it reminds me of that on Nehru's request, Kennedy had actually ordered the 7th Fleet in 1962, during the 1962 war, to move into the Indian Ocean, but it never appeared. But those are the vacillations of history, so to say. And we are now again in that 1962 stage. But we're coming to the fag end of this podcast, but I couldn't help but ask you, the historian's gaze into the future, so to say. And there appears to be, the history appears to be repeating itself once again as Beijing preoccupies the growing strategic relationship between India and US. Are there any parallels between the Cold War era and the contemporary times in understanding the role of China in India's bilateral relationship?
I think history, at the very least, I don't know if it will repeat itself because circumstances are quite different, but it does rhyme. And, circumstances are different because, for example, the economic angle in the relationship in the triangle today, each country has economic relations and ties that it did not have in the 50s and 60s, for instance. But I do think they are echoes. And the book doesn't. When you read the book, the kind of chunk of the big bulk of the book is history. I want the reader to be able to hear the echoes. I don't try to point them out, but I think you do. You will hear echoes of the present day, and I'll. This is the phase. If I had to put together, what is this phase that's it's parallel to? In many ways, this is a phase in that convergent phase where, much like in the late, from about 1957 onwards, how the US and India's shared concerns about China's behavior had drawn the two countries together in a partnership, an alignment, not an alliance, but an alignment. And that entailed the US helping India build India's capabilities, but also providing kind of a certain balance of power in the region. But essentially kind of put a lot of effort into economic, billions of dollars of economic aid, but also kind of some supply of military equipment. And then kind of this implicit security assurance. In some ways, they went further than we are today. And so the fact that China has brought these two countries together again. But I think that history also offers both a sense of kind of realistic, perhaps a lesson to hold realistic expectations, but also not to kind of rule out that certain things will happen. So let me just briefly talk about that, which is one, it is not natural or inevitable that concern about China will drive the US and India together. One of the points I make in the book, because history tells us that, is that just like after 1963, the US and India can think of China as posing a challenge, a big challenge. But if they don't agree on how to tackle that challenge, that is the approach, the ways and means, that can actually lead to the two countries' convergence at least starting to dissipate. And so you see the alignment not be sustainable then. And it's a caution to policymakers today, that you actively have to work to try to get at least some convergence on approach, or at the very least manage your differences. What were the differences in the historical sense? Some of which we see today, including the role of Russia today. The India sees Russia as a partner, is buying equipment for it, including the S-400 defense platform. Now, the US does not like that. There are potential sanctions on India if India buys it, though there's a potential for a waiver. That tells you that if the US actually imposes, for example, those sanctions, it will rule itself out of that part of the relationship with India, much like it did in the 60s. So you have to find ways of kind of making choices that will lead to this alignment being sustainable. It's not a given. I think also the fact that in the past, India's kind of diversification or non-alignment became an obstacle in the relationship. Today, I think the US is more understanding of that, because I think in some ways we are in this era of coalitions rather than alliances. But I think those are important lessons. I think finally, just like in the 60s, if the two countries cannot prove to the other that they are both not just capable of putting the resources in to play that deterrence or balancing role against China, that they're not committed to a broader set of goals, that they are not, their willingness might be there to play a role, but their capability and commitment in the form of being very distracted with domestic issues, differences over, and pursuing domestic policies that are actually holding the two countries back, whether that's economic, whether that's societal, that could lead to disillusionment. So you could have the US, for example, questioning that India is capable of playing a balancing role, whether because it's too distracted with domestic political issues, whether because it's not undertaking the economic reforms, or whether that it's not willing to put in the military and investment in military and intelligence capabilities required. On the other hand, India could start to question the US, that is it too involved in kind of polarized polity at home, in not rebuilding, and is that or odd cuts in, or a stalled defense budget, or still a very large one, is there going to be a questioning of the US commitment to Asia and alliances and partnership over the next few years. So I think that history offers a lesson. There are parallels in terms of how one should see the relationship today. But I also do think, just to end on that, a slightly positive note, one of the things that people are always, I think, observers sometimes underestimate how much the US and India can and will do with each other. That, oh, that's not going to happen. And frankly, left to us outside, kind of, flies on the wall, so to speak, not even on the wall, on the outside of the wall, where we're constantly, I think, being pessimist. If you look at what's happened in the last 20 years, or even the last 5 to 10 years, how much the US-India relationship has changed. They're not even, in some ways, haven't even gone as far as the countries did in the 60s, but in some ways have gone much further than they have. But there's certain things today that, people behave like the sky is going to fall if the US and India do together. And then you look back at the 60s, there were U-2s taking off from Indian air bases then. There was joint CIA, IB, then RAW didn't exist, but the Intelligence Bureau working together on a number of different projects. India helped, the US helped set up India's Aviation Research Center. So, I think this book also shows that some of the constraints the US and India put on each other, they've already done these things before. So it's a question of remembering that these things are possible, and India can still keep its strategic autonomy. And in the US case, India doesn't need to sign an alliance to do some of these things.
Yeah, on that note, including a radioactive activity tracking device on Nanda Devi, which later became
floating around there
during Morarji Desai time, the period of Morarji Desai's prime ministership. With those prescient insights, we will have to end this very interesting conversation. And we are highly thankful for Dr. Tanvi Madan to have shared her views on the book. I cannot waive a hard copy for advertising her brilliant work, because I got the book on Kindle. But for all of those who want to be enlightened over the course of not only the history of India-US relations and the China's role in it, but also want to have a historical insight into what the relationship would look like, I would highly recommend reading The Fateful Triangle. Thank you, Dr. Madan, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Yogesh, and thanks to John as well for putting this together.